I'll never forget the night I found out what was really hiding in my attic. It had started small, little things I brushed off as the house settling. I'd recently moved into this modest, creaky, two-story house in an old, quiet neighborhood. People describe the area as sleepy, so the occasional sounds felt normal. Creaky wood, pipes making odd noises. It was all part of the house's charm, or so I told myself. But the charm started to wear off quickly. The noises from above were sporadic at first, coming late at night, around the time I'd drift off. I'd hear faint thuds and soft scraping sounds, almost as if someone, or something, was pacing above me. Some nights it was more insistent, like a steady, rhythmic dragging moving across the attic. I'd lie awake in bed, telling myself it was just the house settling, maybe a squirrel trapped up there. Yet, it never failed to give me the strangest feeling. As the nights passed, the sound became more frequent. It was like something, or someone, wanted me to notice it. One night, after a particularly exhausting day at work, I was lying in bed, finally ready for sleep. I had just begun to drift off when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and slow, right above my head. They moved from one end of the attic to the other, and then stopped directly above me. My heart started pounding. Every logical thought told me to stay in bed, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to see what was making the noise. Grabbing my flashlight, I took a deep breath, steeling myself as I swung my legs over the edge of the bed. My bare feet hit the cold floor, and I felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. I opened my bedroom door as quietly as I could and walked into the hallway. The attic door was in the ceiling, just outside my bedroom. It was one of those pull-down ladders, and I remember staring at it, trying to summon every ounce of courage I had. As I reached up and tugged on the cord, the door unfolded with a loud, creaky groan, breaking the dead silence of the house. The ladder lowered slowly, like something out of a horror movie. I stood there for a moment, flashlight in hand, staring into the dark void above. The smell was the first thing to hit me. It was thick, musty, and tinged with a sharp, metallic tang that made my stomach turn. I climbed up the ladder. As my head rose above the floor of the attic, I swept my flashlight across the room. The beam cut through thick dust, illuminating piles of old furniture, forgotten boxes, and the occasional cobweb. The air was frigid up there, an unnatural cold that made my breath mist in the light. I tried to tell myself it was just because the attic was unheated, but something about the chill felt wrong. I scanned the space, seeing nothing out of the ordinary until my light landed on the far corner of the attic. There was an old mattress lying on the floor. It was filthy, covered in grime and stains I didn't want to think about. Surrounding it were crumpled food wrappers, empty water bottles, and chillingly, a small pile of clothing. Panic rose in my chest as I realized what this meant. Someone had been living in my attic. Maybe they still were. Suddenly, a sound echoed from behind a stack of old boxes, a soft rustling like fabric brushing against wood. My heart nearly stopped. I was not alone. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear. Then a figure stepped out from behind the boxes. He was tall, almost gaunt, his clothes tattered and filthy. His hair was matted, and his eyes, wild and bloodshot, gleamed in the dim light. A twisted grin spread across his face as he saw me, and he took a step forward, a rusty, serrated knife clutched in his hand. I stumbled back, barely catching myself from falling down the ladder. "Get out," I yelled, my voice barely more than a terrified whisper. The man's grin only widened, as if he was relishing the fear etched on my face. He took another slow, deliberate step toward me, the knife glinting ominously in the beam of my flashlight. My mind raced. I had no weapons, no escape plan, perhaps. No escape plan. No way to defend myself against this intruder. Desperation flooded my veins as I realized I had to act fast or I wouldn't be getting out of that attic at all. As he moved closer, I did the only thing I could think of. I swung my flashlight at him, aiming for his head. The light connected with a sickening crack, and he staggered back, clutching his face. I didn't wait to see if he'd recover. I turned and practically threw myself down the ladder, hitting the floor and slamming the attic door shut behind me. I bolted it with shaky hands, adrenaline coursing through me as I sprinted down the hallway and out of my house. The night air was freezing, but I didn't stop until I was several blocks away, gasping for breath, my entire body shaking. I finally stopped in front of a lit convenience store, leaning against the wall as I dialed 911. The police arrived at my house shortly after. They searched the attic thoroughly, but the man was gone. However, they did find the mattress, the clothes, the empty food wrappers, and, disturbingly, a notebook. When the officer handed it to me, my hands shook as I flipped through the pages. Inside, there were detailed notes about me, my daily routine, my comings and goings, even my conversations on the phone that he must have overheard. There were pages with sketches of me sitting at my kitchen table, watching TV, even sleeping. The worst part was a message he'd written at the end of the notebook. "You can run, but I'll always know where to find you." They never found him, and I moved out of the house the next day, not even stopping to pack properly. The memory of his twisted smile, the gleam of the knife, the chill of the attic, those things still haunt me. And every once in a while, in the dead of night, I hear faint footsteps above me, a dragging sound, the soft rustle of fabric. And I'm reminded that somewhere out there, he's still watching, waiting. And every so often, I hear whispers from above. I don't dare look up. I was thrilled to finally have a place of my own. The old Victorian house I'd purchased was a bit out of town and rough around the edges, but it had charm, and I'd scored it for a great price. I chalked up the discount to the property's age and remote location, both positives in my book. I thought the house was perfect, right down to its musty, creaky attic. That is, until I started hearing the noises. It began subtly, a faint scratching in the walls at night. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or maybe some mice making their way through the aging structure. I brushed it off at first, determined not to let my imagination ruin the excitement of my new home, but after the first week, the sounds became impossible to ignore. Every night, as I lay in bed, I'd hear a soft creaking from the attic above, almost like the weight of careful footsteps. It was quiet but deliberate, as though someone or something was moving carefully, aware of my presence. One night, around midnight, the sounds became clearer and something distinctly human. The dragging of a heavy object echoed down the walls. My heart pounded, and I lay there frozen, clutching the covers. In the morning light, I felt silly. The sound could have been anything. A loose shingle, perhaps, or even a raccoon. I kept telling myself that, but the dread gnawed at me. One night, I decided to inspect the attic and settle my nerves once and for all. Grabbing a flashlight and a kitchen knife just in case, I made my way up the narrow stairs, heart hammering against my ribs. The attic door creaked as I pushed it open. Dust particles danced in the beam of my flashlight, and the air was thick and stale, carrying a scent I couldn't quite place. As I swung the flashlight around, my eyes fell on a few stacks of dusty boxes, old furniture draped in yellowing sheets, and a faint track in the dust across the floorboards. Something had been dragged across the room recently. My pulse quickened. That's when I saw it, a small, crumpled pile of blankets pushed against the far wall. My breath hitched. It looked like a makeshift bed. And then, next to it, glinting in the light, lay a chipped, rusted knife. Chills ran down my spine as I took in the scattered food wrappers and the empty water bottles. Someone had been living up here. I backed out of the attic slowly, shutting the door behind me as quietly as I could, each creak of the steps feeling like a betrayal. Once downstairs, I locked the attic door and barricaded it with a heavy chair. I knew I should call the police, but my rational brain kept arguing that maybe it was just a squatter who had left. After all, I hadn't seen anyone, yet. The nights that followed were nerve-wracking. I'd lie awake in bed listening, every creak and groan of the house amplified by my imagination. I didn't dare go back to the attic, but on the 7th night, the sounds became undeniable. Soft footsteps, a shuffling in the walls, and then, unmistakably, the slow, careful turn of the attic doorknob. My heart leaped into my throat as I grabbed my phone, thumb hovering over the call button. But I couldn't bring myself to dial it yet. I wanted to be sure. I listened, breath shallow as the footsteps grew louder, descending the staircase. I clamped my hand over my mouth to keep from gasping. The sound stopped just outside my bedroom door. Silence pressed down around me as I waited, motionless, not even daring to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, I heard him retreat, the faint sound of his steps fading up the stairs and the creak of the attic door closing. The next morning, I inspected my bedroom door. There, smeared across the knob, was a faint handprint. And worse, a small, folded note lay on the floor just outside, with a message scrawled in jagged, shaky handwriting. Why did you lock me out? I couldn't ignore it any longer. I called the police and explained what I'd found. They sent over an officer who swept the attic and found plenty of evidence that someone had been living there. Clothes, a stash of stolen items, even an old journal with incoherent ramblings. But there was no sign of the intruder. They reassured me that the person had probably moved on and advised me to stay somewhere else for a few days. But when I returned to the house later that week, I still felt the unease, like eyes watching me from the shadows. And then, just when I was starting to relax again, the nightmare truly began. It happened during a thunderstorm. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled around the house. I tried to keep busy, fixing dinner, watching TV, pretending the past few weeks hadn't happened. But as the storm grew worse, the power flickered and eventually went out, plunging the house into total darkness. The only light came from the occasional flash of lightning outside, and then I heard it, a slow, deliberate scraping sound coming from above me. My blood ran cold. He was back. Grabbing my flashlight, I moved through the dark, hoping the police had been right, that he was gone. But the sounds grew louder, closer, until I realized with horror that they weren't coming from the attic anymore. They were coming from inside the walls. He was moving through the space between the walls, slowly, deliberately, right above my head. I backed away, my mind racing, unsure of where to go, what to do. I turned to run for the front door, but something slammed against the wall, and a voice, raspy, chilling, whispered through the plaster. I was here first. I bolted, heart pounding, as I scrambled out of the house and into the night, running until my legs gave out. until I was blocks away. In the distance, my house loomed, its dark windows watching like the house itself was in on some horrible secret. The police never found him. To this day, I don't know who he was or how long he'd been living there before I moved in. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when I close my eyes, I still hear that voice in my head. I was here first. I had just moved into an old but charming two-story house on the outskirts of town. It was supposed to be my fresh start, a peaceful escape, and at first it was. The house creaked and groaned like any old house, but I'd expected that until the noises started changing. At night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I began hearing footsteps above me, slow, deliberate, each one echoing through the ceiling. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the house settling, or even the wind. But deep down, I knew that footsteps sounded different. They were heavier, and they always seemed to come in a slow, steady rhythm, a pattern. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I gathered my courage and pulled down the attic door in the hallway, a cold, dusty ladder dropping into place. My flashlight barely cut through the pitch-black void above, the beam trembling with my hands. With each step up, I could feel the temperature drop, and I was hit by an overwhelming musty odor. When I reached the attic, I swept the flashlight around. Nothing. Just stacks of old boxes, spiderwebs clinging to corners, and dust thick enough to choke on. I tried to laugh it off, even convincing myself that maybe I'd overreacted it. But just as I was about to turn back down the ladder, I heard a faint whisper, so close it felt like it was right next to my ear. "Hello." I nearly fell down the ladder in my rush to get out of there. Heart pounding, I slammed the attic door shut, breathing heavily, refusing to look back up. I barely slept that night, every sound amplified in the darkness, making me jump. But for days after, the attic stayed silent. Then, one night, I woke to the familiar, dreadful sound, footsteps above me. Only this time, they were faster, more frantic, like something was pacing. I didn't want to believe it was happening again, but the heavy footsteps were impossible to ignore. And they kept getting louder, as if whatever was up there was getting more impatient. The sound became a part of my nights, and with each passing day, I grew more worn out, barely able to function. Finally, I called my friend, Danny, desperate to have someone else witness this. He was skeptical, but agreed to stay the night. The evening started normal enough, talked about work, and he teased me about my haunted house. But when midnight struck, he went quiet. The footsteps started again, and I could see the color drain from his face as he heard them too. "Dude, that's not an animal or pipes," he whispered. Feeling braver with him there, we decided to investigate. Armed with a baseball bat and a flashlight, we climbed into the attic together. The space felt colder than ever, the smell sharper. The silence was unsettling as we swept the beam of the flashlight around. Nothing. Then, just as we were about to give up, the flashlight flickered, catching something unusual in the corner. An old, dust-covered mirror propped against the wall. It seemed out of place, eerie. As we walked closer, I noticed something strange in the reflection. It wasn't us. Instead, two figures stood there, watching us from inside the mirror. They looked exactly like us, but their expressions were twisted, almost inhuman, their eyes wide with a sinister glint. I turned to Danny Thing. He let out a scream. The figures in the mirror, they had started moving, and their movements didn't match ours. They stepped forward, inching closer in the reflection. yet staying trapped behind the glass. Panicking, we bolted for the attic door, but it slammed shut on its own. I was trembling as I jiggled the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Then, I heard the voices, a low, guttural whisper right in my ear, words I couldn't understand, but that sent chills down my spine. "Help us," it hissed, barely audible, like a sigh. I didn't want to look back, but a cold, unnatural force seemed to pull my gaze back to the mirror. The figures inside had moved closer, almost pressed against the glass. Their faces were clearer now, distorted with twisted grins, their hands reaching toward us, and then I noticed something. The attic around us in the reflection was different, cleaner, newer. It was like looking at the attic from another time or another world entirely, a version where those figures weren't trapped. Danny and I were paralyzed, watching as the figures slowly raised their hands and pressed against the mirror's surface. I could feel a cold sweat on my skin, and Danny was muttering something under his breath, sounding close to tears. Then, in one horrifying moment, I realized they weren't pressing from inside. They were pushing through the glass. The mirror began to crack, thin lines splintering out like a spider's web. And with each fracture, the figures got closer, their smiles widening. I was frozen in fear as a hand began to push through, the fingers curling, reaching for us. Suddenly, Danny grabbed me, yanking me down the ladder as the sound of shattering glass echoed through the attic. We stumbled down, nearly tripping over each other as we bolted for the front door. We didn't look back, not once. We ran until we reached the street, gasping for air under the streetlights, which felt like the only safe place. We looked up at my house, which stood dark and silent. No sound. No footsteps. Just stillness. Danny and I didn't speak as we left. I crashed at his place that night, too terrified to go back. The next day, I went to a local historian to ask about the house. As I recounted the events, he listened in silence, his face growing pale. When I finished, he sighed and showed me an old newspaper article about a family who'd lived in my house decades ago. A mother and father with 2 sons who had vanished. One night, leaving only bloody footprints that led up to the attic. No bodies were ever found. Just the footprints. That night, I returned to my house, hoping to grab a few essentials. But when I opened the front door, a cold chill ran over me. There, in the dust on the floor, were fresh footprints leading up to the attic. But they weren't from shoes. They were bare, like someone, or something, had walked out of the mirror and into my home. And that was the last time I ever went back.